Okay, let's roll. Let's movie talk, right? Roll the film. Chapter 31, Expanding the Conversation, Mozart, Chamber Music, and Larger Forms. I want to open up the whiteboard here quickly and remind us that we're talking about multi-movement forms, right? And where we have the symphony, and we have the string quartet, which is kind of like a miniature symphony. And then we said that the multi-movement form has the first movement is fast and usually a sonata allegro form. And that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter, sonata allegro form, what that is. And the second movement is typically a theme and variations, or a ternary form, ABA. And the third movement is usually, is a dance movement. And early on, it's usually the minuet and trio, which is two minuets, and we'll do that in a genre swing where we talk about stylized dances. A stylized dance is where you take a dance that's normally danced to, and then you modify it for concert performance, and it's not for dancing. That's what a stylized dance is. And then the fourth movement is often in sonata allegro form also, right? It could be, it's a fast movement, or it might be a rondo or some kind of modified rondo form. And so far, we, in the classical period, and we said the classical period is from when? From 1750, right, to 1825. And what happened in this time, right, in general? Two things, two revolutions. The American Revolution, 1776, and the French Revolution, which I believe is 1789. Two different kinds of revolution. The American Revolution was generally thought as from against an occupier, somebody that was a foreigner that was occupying your land, and we wanted them out. Not everybody agreed to that, though. And the French Revolution was against their own government, so it was a different kind of a revolution. And the French Revolution did eventually Napoleon was the leader, and he marched across Europe and freed Europe from a typical system that was top down, and it didn't have opportunities for most people to be involved in this system. They were outsiders, and so Napoleon was initially considered a liberator, and then later he was a tyrant like everybody else that had been before him. So, incidentally, right, we listened to the string quartet by Haydn, and it was the fourth movement, and it was a rondo. And we listened to the second movement of Haydn's, one of his London symphonies, and it was a theme and variations, the second movement. So let's go to the PowerPoint here. And it tells us this chapter is really on sonata allegro form, and it's all an example by Mozart, and then an example by Mozart of a minuet and trio. And we'll do that, and when we do the stylized dances genre. So the first movement of the classical multi-movement cycle is usually in a fast tempo and in sonata allegro form. You've heard that someplace. With three main sections in a sonata allegro form: the exposition, development, and recapitulation. We'll talk quite a bit about the form in this style, in this chapter. So Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a child prodigy who started to write music before the age of 5, it was not good music. Contributed to nearly all musical genres of the classical era, including symphonies, sonatas, concertos, chamber music, sacred music, and of opera. And of course, we already listened to and sampled his opera Don Giovanni, and then we sampled his sacred music, the Requiem Mass, when we did functional sacred music. And one of Mozart's best known chamber musics is a piece called Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which translates to be a little night music. It's a serenade for strings. So we talked about the multi-movement forms as being a symphony and a string quartet, 4 movements, and we said a concerto and a sonata were 3 movements. A serenade is not a symphony, and it is also 4 movements. It's a piece of music that's for a social gathering and not for a concert. Typical forms of the classical period, right? Theme and variations form, we sampled that. It's basically one theme, and then the subsequent sections are variations of that theme, no departure, no return, and we would put a schematic as this: A, then A prime, A double prime, triple prime, quadruple prime, etc., as many variations. And there have been theme and variations with multiple variations. Just a note, right? There is a piece of music that I played for classical guitar that was a theme and variations, but it started with the variations and ended with the theme. And the piece of music was by Benjamin Britten, and it was about different aspects or levels of sleep, and light sleep, deep sleep, restless sleep, and then the end of the piece of the variations was the theme, which was actually a Renaissance piece of music, and it was about like finally getting to sleep. And then a minuet and trio form, we'll sample this when we do the stylized dances, because a minuet is a dance, and the trio is typically another minuet, so it's a minuet, another minuet, and then the first minuet, so it's ABA form. And then rondo form, we listen to that from the string quartet, the 4th movement, and it doesn't have to be like this, but it's generally you have one theme, and then new material, and then that first theme, and then new material, and it turns out to be very symmetrical. And this one we're going to do the sonata allegro form, which has an exposition, a development, and recapitulation, A, B, A prime, which means it's not exactly the same. So general definitions of terms. Sonata is a sounded piece of music, and a cantata is a sung piece of music. Cadence, a couple examples, because this is very important in the classical period, and we're on absolute music, which was the dominant popular style in the classical period, was absolute music. And so classical music is about the form, and like knowing where the beginnings are, the endings, and what happens in between. So a harmonic or melodic formula that occurs at the end of a phrase, section, or a movement, a formula that conveys a momentary or permanent sense of conclusion, a musical punctuation mark. So like we have commas and we have periods, which are different kinds of punctuation points. We have the same thing in music. And we talk about cadences, like if you have a poem, right? Mary Had a Little Lamb. We would say that's a cadence, but it's not a full cadence, right? And so I'm going to play, this has some examples of the difference between the open cadence, a closed cadence, deceptive cadence, and then a deceptive cadence that goes to a closed cadence. First of all, closed cadence, you hear it, and a phrase by definition has to move to a cadence. And a closed cadence meaning it sounds like it's done. It could be over. Open cadence means it comes to a resting point, but we know that there's more to come. And then a deceptive cadence is where it comes when we think it's going to be a closed cadence, but something else happens and it fools us and it deceives us. And then deceptive cadence, it turns into a closed cadence, is the deception, and then it goes to the full cadence. So these examples: open cadence, closed cadence, deceptive cadence to closed cadence. Okay, this is so important that I'm going to play it again. So now that you know what's going on, there are 4 phrases. Listen again, those different types of cadences. Open cadence. Closed cadence, or at rest. What the? Great. Okay, now the word sonata. In the Baroque period, they used the word sonata, and it's different than the way we're going to use it here in the classical period. But the term was applied to multi-movement instrumental works for both solo instruments and chamber works. This composer and a number of other composers, noted that he's born the same year as Bach and died 7 years later, right? J.S. Bach. That this composer and other composers wrote one movement pieces of music for harpsichord called sonatas. They're just one movement. Bach wrote multi-movement music selections called sonatas. He wrote them for violin, for flute, and trio sonatas. Trio sonatas are multi-movement works for 2 melodic instruments and basso continuo. Remember that word? So there could be 4 instruments in a trio sonata. 2 melodic instruments, the basso continuo could be a bass and a chordal instrument. So the definition of sonata in the classical era and the way we generally use it today is 2 ways. One, it's an instrumental genre and a multi-movement work for solo piano or piano plus 1 other instrument. So we'll sample music from a sonata by Beethoven. It's written for solo piano, and he wrote sonatas for cello and piano. And then the sonata form, which is really the focus of this chapter, is a musical form that sometimes is sometimes referred to as a sonata allegro form, in order to differentiate it from the instrumental genre called sonata. So sonata and sonata form, also called sonata allegro form, also called first movement form, because so often in the multi-movement cycle that the first movement is in sonata allegro form. And that applies to the symphony, and it applies to the string quartet, and it applies to a sonata, and it applies also to a concerto. The first movement is often sonata allegro form. So sonata form, right, is a formal compositional process that evolved in order to accommodate the presentation and interaction of multiple principal themes. This is kind of an unusual form because it has 2 distinct themes, and that's the premise of the whole piece. So it evolved from the Baroque binary dance form, and I'm going to look at that here. And it was inspired by the dramatic procedures inherent in opera. Remember opera? When did it start? 1600, 1600, the invention of opera. And so opera was the avant-garde music, and it affected the invention of the concerto, and then it invented, initiated or inspired the sonata form. So here we have a schematic that shows binary form in the Baroque period. This is typically where it was. You had an A section that was repeated, and then you had a B section that repeated. But also in this music, it would start in one key, and then by the end of that A section, it would have modulated to a related key. And the modulation is something that's disguised, and you don't really realize that a modulation is taking place. And then you get the new modulation, you may not realize that you're at a new key. So then when it repeats, you go back to the beginning. So it's like we've already moved away, and we go back. Oh, it becomes clearer that you have departed, and you go back to that home key. And then again, it travels to a related key. And then the B section would start on the related key and work its way back to the home key. And then it'd repeat, and because of the repeat, you'd hear the home key and then back to the related key. So you'd hear the contrast. This is typical of a binary form. And then as it turned out, we have another form called rounded binary, because this is what happened. They'd have that A section repeated, and then the B section would start. But with the B section, when it came back to the home key, they would insert some of this music from the A section. So it, ties it all together. We have the A section again, new material, back to the home key, and then, oh yeah, we remember that from back here. And then it goes back to, we have that key jump from the home key back to the related key, and then we work our way back to the home key and the initial information. So that's rounded binary form. And here is another schematic, and it shows how we then jumped to the sonata allegro form from this, right? So here's our binary form. A section, B section shows the first key, and then to a dominant key or a related key, usually the dominant key. And so you switch back, you hear that, and the next section would start on that related key and then work us back to the home key. And then this is the same thing, but rounded binary, right? So the key material would be used in the same way. And the sonata allegro form is really, again, we say sonata allegro form is ternary, but the way it's written, looks like it's binary, right? But again, we have this A section, and it has, which is called the exposition. And the unique thing here now in the sonata allegro form, we have two themes. And then, so the first theme is presented, and then the music transitions and modulates to a new key, and there's a cadence, and then the theme too, and it repeats. So again, we hear the exposition twice. So we'll have heard both of the themes. And then the B section is the development section, where the composer will use the thematic material from theme 1 and theme 2 and create conflict, and improvises basically with those two melodies. Then he works his way back to the home key, and there's a cadence generally. And then we have the exposition again, but it's not a repeat, it's a recapitulation. So it's not stated exactly the same way. And primarily you have the theme 1, and then you have a bridge, but it does not modulate. And then the theme 2 is presented, and we end out without departure. So here is another way to look at this binary dance form as opposed to the sonata allegro form, right? And the binary, we have the A section and the B section, and then this return to A, which is the rounded binary. And here we have the exposition, and then it's repeated. And then we have the development section, and then the recapitulation. So a classical sonata form movement differs from high Baroque binary dance form movement in its sheer scale and the clarity of its sectional articulation. So we're not in the Baroque style, we're in the classical style. All right, so the sonata form generally has 3 sections. I put 4, but and it could be even more than that, but let's say that it has 3 sections we consider to be the exposition, the development, and recapitulation. So again, the exposition has theme 1, and if you can have 2 themes, let's not use the same kind of themes. Let's use one and another one that's very contrasting so we can notice right away, oh, it's a different theme. So we have theme 1, typically the more dramatic of the themes, and then we have the modulation, and then theme 2 is the more lyric. And again, they're in different keys. Sometimes they're even called the masculine and feminine themes. And so they're separated by this modulating bridge, right? So what does this modulating bridge do? Well, it has a dual role. For one, it modulates, and then it frames theme 2 so that when it begins, it sounds important in its own right. It's not something else. It's like we have theme 1, modulation, new frame, theme 2. And then the development section, after we've done exposition twice, generally, the development section is a sustained action sequence during which the themes are developed. And then in the recapitulation, the themes return in the original order, but with important changes that reduce the degree of contrast between the themes and reconcile the themes to one another, right? So we want to close things out and end the piece on a happy note. Everybody's satisfied. No more conflict. Stability. Most sonata form movements conclude with a coda, right? A tail, which brings the movement to its conclusion. It doesn't have to have that. And sometimes they'll start with an introduction. So this sonata form is built on contrast. The key to following a sonata form movement is to perceive the difference between. And so when you listen to a piece of music and you know it's in sonata form, if you can latch on to these 3 things, it's like, am I listening to thematic material? Is this transitional period where something is just moving someplace else? Or is it cadential, right? And so you have these long cadences that go on to tell you it's ending, it's ending, it's ending. I know it's ending. Will you end it? Okay, that's kind of what happens, right? And then so again, the contrast between harmonically stable music and unstable music. And between character music, meaning the themes, right? Theme 1 and theme 2, like 2 different characters. And then action music, right? Between the theme 1 and theme 2, there's this activity that is moving someplace. And you can say, well, it's not thematic material, it's action, it's going somewhere. And the development section also is this restless activity. And then the concluding music, the cadence material, right? So we're listening to those 3 types of things. Is it themes that are being presented? Is it transitional music? Or is it cadence material? Exposition versus the recapitulation. What's the difference? We don't say a repeat because a recapitulation means I'm not going to necessarily say it the same way and I'll say the same ideas, but I may use different words, right? The big difference between the exposition and the recapitulation has to do with reducing the level of contrast between the themes and affecting a tonal reconciliation between the themes. So the exposition, we're trying to show you, 2 different themes, and then recapitulation, well, they're in the same family, right? And we're going to be nice to each other. So in sonata form, the recapitulation, the theme 2 will be heard in the home key, right? In the key of theme 1. So in the exposition, you have the 2 different keys, and the recapitulation, now everything is in 1 key. So by reconciling the themes to each other, the degree of contrast between them here in the recapitulation is reduced exponentially. By reconciling theme 2 and the cadence material to the home key in the recapitulation, the movement can end unambiguously in the home key. Everybody's happy. So what about this modulating bridge? It performs a modulation, right? When we go from one key to another, a change of key, a tonal transition from the conclusion of the theme of 1 to the beginning of theme 2, delivering us to the new key that will inevitably characterize theme 2 in a sonata form exposition. The modulating bridge provides some necessary distance from the dramatic excesses of theme 1, and in doing so paves the way for the frames the generally more lyric theme 2. The modulating bridge to harmony is unstable, right? We know we're going someplace. It's modulating, it's changing. And then that modulating bridge will usually be characterized by non-thematic melodic surface. When you hear it, it's like it's not real clear what's going on. It's because we're going somewhere. So lacking the harmonic gravity provided by resolution and the thematic import provided by a complete thematic statement, a modulating bridge sounds transitional. And regarding the development sections will be based on music materials drawn from the exposition. Development sections will be characterized by harmonic instability, modulations, a lot of changing, right, and thematic fragmentation. So here is this sonata form, a compositional process that evolved to accommodate the presentation and interaction of multiple principal themes, two contrasting principal themes. And then in these large sections, we have exposition to develop and recapitulation. Sometimes it begins with a slow introduction, and then sometimes it ends with this coda, a tag on at the end to close everything out. All right, I'm going to play a piece of music by Sammartini, and he calls it Symphony Number 32. It's the first movement, and I put audio prompts in here. It only takes about 2 minutes to play the whole thing, but I want you to try and listen to the sections, right? The exposition, theme 1, bridge, theme 2, and it repeats. Exposition, theme 1, bridge, theme 2. And then we have the development section, and then cadence and the recapitulation. And again, theme 1, theme 2, but it's in the home key. And then that development section is done again, right? Because this is really the A section and the B section, but we say it's ternary, exposition A, B section B, recapitulation A prime, okay? So this is kind of obnoxious, but it does get the job done as far as pointing out the different, the structure of the piece of music.
Sonata allegro form, exposition, development, recapitulation. Exposition, theme 1. Transition, modulation to new key. Cadence, theme 2. Repeat, exposition, theme 1. Bridge, transition, modulation to new key. Cadence, new key, theme 2. Development section. Modulation back to the home key. Cadence. Recapitulation, theme 1. Bridge, transition, no modulation in the recapitulation. Theme 2. Development, second time. Modulation back to the home key. Cadence. Recapitulation, theme 1. Bridge, transition, no modulation in the recapitulation. Theme 2. End. cadence.
Okay, I'm going to play it again now, right? Sammartini, the Italian, is considered to be the father of sonata allegro form. So again, it's the first movement, and it's an example of sonata allegro form. This is without the prompts. So when you have that theme too, it's so simple. It just goes da dee da da dum ba da 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 bum 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 bum. That's theme two. All right, so here we go. Sonata allegro form. Another graphic on the sonata allegro form, we have the exposition, the development, and recapitulation. So again, what do we have in the exposition? Sometimes a slow introduction, optional, right? And then we have the first theme is presented, and then the bridge. So when you heard that Sammartini, did you notice that section with all the chopping that's going on? It's like, well, there's no thematic material, it's just action, and we're going someplace. That's the bridge. And then we get to that cadence that comes in, and all one here is the theme too. And sometimes there's closing thematic material, but a cadence, end of the exposition, and then the whole thing is done again, right? So then we do that, and then we start the B section, which is the development section, right? And we're in that related key, and then we come back, and usually there's a cadence, not always, and then we'll have the recapitulation, which is not exactly the same thing of the exposition. But we have the first theme, a bridge, but it doesn't modulate. And then we have the second theme in the home key, and then cadence material. Sometimes that is done a second time from the development and the recapitulation. And then sometimes there's a coda, right? The tag on at the end. Now, regarding Mozart, here is a picture of Mozart. Wolfgang, his father was a teacher, was Leopold. So sometimes you'll see music, not very often, but you'll see it's Leopold, and that's the father. He was a teacher, and not famous as being a composer, but I'm sure he had a big influence on Wolfgang and his sister. And actually, he took them as children, and they toured Europe so the father could make some money. And they would do tricks like having the kids play in the same keyboard and and blindfolded and things like this to entertain. It's always amazing to see young children playing or doing anything at a real high level. It's so impressive. Here is Mozart, the young man. Of course, he was never an old man because he lived from 1756 to 1791, so he was only like 35 when he died. We talked about that before. Here is Europe at the time of 1789. So Mozart died in 1791. But notice, and it shows the populations, France was the most populated country. There was no Germany. It's all these small states. There was no Italy, right? And here is the Austrian Habsburg Empire, right? Including Austria, Netherlands, and Milan, Italy was part of that. See the same color over here. Spain as well was affiliated by marriage with this stuff. And here's a little detailed map. Mozart was from Salzburg. Here is Vienna over here. So this is this Austrian Empire, and all these little countries, right? Electorates of that didn't become Germany until the late 1800s, after the American Civil War. But France was a country, and with the large population, Napoleon always had people that wanted to be part of his army. And Venetian Republic, notice that. Oh, that's Venice, right? So Venice, I think, is right over here someplace. Okay. So Mozart's music. His music is known to be elegant, songful melodies. One famous piano player was asked, what's the most difficult composer's music to play? And he said Mozart. People said, Mozart? His music's not nearly as difficult as other composers. But he said, because it's so simple and clear that you make one little bloop and it just sticks out. So you can't, but in other words, you're playing these extravagant music like Beethoven, and you can make a mistake and nobody would notice it. So Mozart wrote the comic operas. We sampled Don Giovanni. He wrote over 40 symphonies, and he wrote piano concertos, quite a few. And we'll sample that later time. And he, in his chamber music, he wrote pieces called divertimento, actually plural would be divertimenti, and serenades. And we're going to sample music from his multi-movement cycle called Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a little night music. It's a serenade. A serenade is not for a concert so much as it's for social entertainment. You have a party, and in the background you have music that's being performed, and that's what the intention of this music was. So he uses sonata allegro form in the piece, and it has 4 movements. We're going to sample the first movement here, and the third movement is the minuet and trio. We'll sample that when we do stylized music. So it has the exposition, development, and recapitulation, just what you would expect, although it's much more complex than the example by Sammartini of sonata allegro form. So, but we're going to have the same thing. We have the theme 1, and it has a theme, we call it the rocket theme, right? And which was typical and what people expected. Bum, 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 dum, bottom, bottom, bum, 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 bum. So it goes up and it comes back down like a rocket. And then the second theme is more like da 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 dum, bum, 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 beam, da 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 dum, bum, dee dum. So it's lyrical, and so we have one that's jumping around, the other one's nice and smooth. So and see if you can listen for those 2 themes, and with the transitional music in between that's taking us from the home key to the contrasting key. And then we have a cadence, and then the whole thing repeats, the exposition repeats. And then we have the development section, which starts in the related key, and where you have conflict and tension. and a lot of activity and restlessness, which then comes back to the home key and usually a cadence, and then we start the recapitulation, right? The statement of the themes, but only in the home key, and then there is a coda at the end. So again, the theme one is disjunct. Remember that term, disjunct, right? It jumps around. And then theme two is conjunct. It's really smooth, so the contrast. The development section is not very long, and what you expect here. So notice that this piece of music, can you say eine kleine Nachtmusik? German, right? And it has that a lot of emphasis on the consonants. And so it has that harsh, aggressive sound, eine kleine Nachtmusik. So the first movement has 4 movements, is in sonata allegro form. The second movement is a slow, which is what we'd expect, and it's in rondo form. The third movement is a dance in minuet and trio, just what you expect. And the fourth movement is fast, and it's in a modified sonata rondo form, whatever that is. Okay, here we go. Let's listen to it. If you didn't latch on to all the different sections, don't be disappointed in yourself. You need to listen to it many times and with attention and looking for those sections in order to identify them, okay? So you have to hear a piece of music many times and then be aware of what you're listening to. So this includes the half of chapter 31 about Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik and regarding the first movement Allegro in sonata allegro form. So that concludes this section.